Hello, I'm Nicola Curtin. I'm the COE Program Evaluator, and I hope to meet all of you in person at some point. But I'm going to create a few presentations for you, and the first one here is about developing effective evaluation measures. As you work on your individual projects, you will, of course, also be planning an evaluation of those projects. And so I want to talk about kind of give you a broad overview to what evaluation is, what the purpose of it is, the goals, some common types of evaluations, and also talk about ethics when we're conducting evaluations. So let's start with what you should leave this lecture knowing, which is, you should have a broad understanding of what the goals are of a program evaluation. Hopefully you'll be able to use some key terms that we use when we talk about evaluations, and understanding some of the different methods, and what are their accompanying advantages and disadvantages. And let me try and move this for you here. Sorry. So, I want to start with talking about the differences between research versus evaluation. And this is a quotation from a very well-known program evaluator. And he says, research seeks to prove while evaluation seeks to improve. And I think, when I'm teaching research methods, I say we don't actually seek to prove anything with research. We seek to provide evidence supporting a theory, right? We never really prove something. But the distinction, I think, here is helpful because evaluation is really not, it's about adding knowledge in order to make something better, right? So we've developed an intervention or a program that we think is going to address a social issue, and we want to know that it is functioning as well as it should be, that it is leading to the outcomes that we think it will be. Research, on the other hand, is about testing particular kinds of hypotheses, rooted in theory. I think the best programs are evidence-based and thus in some ways based on research or evidence that we already have about what's effective to address a particular social issue. But in evaluation, we're really wanting to improve our program. And so I think that with that in mind, it helps us understand that evaluations are really effective in as much as they're useful, right? So they should be systematic in the same way that research is systematic. You have to sort of think about some of the same issues around control and what you're measuring and how you're measuring it. They should be iterative. I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. And they should be used to inform whether or not your program is effective, right? So you usually initiate a program with particular kinds of goals or outcomes for the people who it's benefiting, your participants, your clients. It might also help you make future programming decisions and decisions about resources. So questions when we're doing an evaluation are really driven by the program or the project. They're really driven by, what do we need to know right now in this moment to make our program better? And in that sense, they're iterative because you never really stop doing evaluations. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Evaluations are also really about deriving judgments, right? So was your intervention, is your program effective? Is it worth the resources spent, right? Do the benefits justify the costs? And what are there benefits to stakeholders or community members? These are the kinds of questions evaluations oftentimes ask. I really want to stress this piece about evaluations being iterative. And what I mean about that is that when we conduct an evaluation, we're not really done, right? So we oftentimes use our evaluations to improve or change, not necessarily discard, although sometimes that happens too, a program. And what that means is no program is really going to be or is meant to be perfect, right? We're always going to need to be evaluating our programs or our practices and finding ways to respond to clients or employees or patients. To collect their feedback. And I think this is really important to remember because when we think about this process, evaluations inform us, we move forward, and then we evaluate again. So they really are iterative. And it may be, of course, in your project that you don't quite experience that, but I think it's really helpful to think about evaluations that way, that the point isn't that we sort of send our patients off or our clients off and never care to hear from them again. I think a helpful definition here is program evaluation is carefully, right, the systematic piece, collecting information about a program or some aspect of a program in order to make some necessary decisions about the program. And that's really important too, that you need to decide up front, what are the decisions that need to be made now? And how can I best design an evaluation to make those decisions? I think it's helpful, before I give you an overview of the types of evaluations, to review some terms related to programming. So when we design a program, we have sort of different pieces. Inputs are the kinds of resources that we need to run a program, right? So we need money, we need facilities, we probably need people to serve. We need staff to do that serving. So if you think about it, if we have a drop-in center, we need a place, right, for that drop-in center to take place. We probably need clients. We might need chairs. We need staff to run the center. All of those things are inputs if you sort of think about your logic model, right? They're sort of off there to the left. The process is how the program is carried out. What is it that we're doing and how are we doing it, right? So what does day-to-day life at our drop-in center look like? What are the kinds of activities we're designing for people? And of course, those really need to serve both our outputs and our outcomes. Sometimes I think people talk about outputs and outcomes as though they were the same, and they're a little bit different. Outputs are really, in some ways, counts. They're units of service, right? So the number of patients that visit our drop-in center in a day or a week or a month, the number of students who go through a pipeline project and a program and then graduate from college. Outcomes are impacts on the people. So they're in some ways sometimes a little bit more almost abstract, right? So, our drop-in program might benefit 50 people might come to our drop-in program, a drop-in counseling program, or a drop-in health improvement program. And then the question for outcomes might be, to what degree are we truly improving those people's health, right? So sort of think about those terms. And I think those terms are helpful also to keep in mind, because your evaluation may target, let's say, different pieces of your overall program logic model. And you need to really think about that. Is your question of the moment about process, right? So are you really interested in understanding better the effectiveness of what you do, which of course you look at outcomes, but maybe even what it is exactly that you're doing? Or do you have a question about whether or not your inputs, right? So you sort of have to look at your inputs it makes sense to use as many as you're using, that you're getting the outputs that you want. So sort of think about these terms as you're thinking about your evaluation. So as I've said, your evaluation plan, how you conduct your evaluation, what you do, is really going to depend on the kinds of decisions that you want to make. It'll also depend on the resources you have on hand. I mean, in some ways, a program evaluation has to be very pragmatic. You're going to have to make decisions about what you can do given your time, given your areas of expertise, how much money you have, etc. So what you really want to do is start in a very targeted way, understanding what is the purpose of your evaluation. What do you need? What choices or decisions do you or do your administrators need to make? And then thinking a little bit about who the audiences are, right? So, and in some ways, who is this benefiting? And of course, oftentimes it's benefiting multiple stakeholders. But sort of thinking about that question too is important as you plan your program evaluation. So you really want to get specific here. The kinds of questions that evaluations often ask, and this is of course why we review those key terms, is how effective are or are our inputs or our processes, right? So are we using our resources in the most efficient process? I mean, in the most efficient manner, are our processes really effective? How are our clients responding to our process? What do they think of our center? What do they think of the activities that we're running? What do our outputs look like? How many clients are we serving? How many people drop by each day, each week, each month, etc.? And has that changed maybe as a result of the program? And then what kinds of outcomes or changes in outcomes are we seeing? Are we really seeing improved health, right? We set up a clinic in an under-resourced community. We know we're serving 100 people a month. And are we seeing then benefits to the community and to those people in changes in health behaviors or overall health? So again, just to return to this, we really need to think about what kinds of data we need when we are planning our evaluation. And of course, this goes back to, again, what choices need to be made. Do we want some self-report data? Do we want to know what clients are thinking about our programs? Or do we want objective data, right? To know how many people we're just serving on a weekly, monthly basis, et cetera. Again, what sources who are we collecting data from? Who are we gathering this information from, or where? And we'll talk a little bit about some of the sources when we talk about different methods. And then we need to make a decision about the best method for collecting this information. And, again, this is one of the things that really distinguishes research from evaluation, is that in evaluation, you have to be pragmatic about this, right? So it might not be the most ideal method that you end up selecting, but it's going to be the most on the ground, effective method that you can select given your resources. You really want to think about your timeline, right? When is this information needed? If you need to make some immediate decisions, then you will need a method that is amenable to that, right? So if you need quick turnaround, you need to sort of really think about choosing a method that's going to allow you to do that. And either way, you want to create a timeline for your project. And then you really want to be realistic about what resources are available to collect this information. It's all well and good to design a fabulous evaluation program, but if you have nobody to carry that out, or you have staff that are already stretched too thin, it won't be done effectively, right? And so ultimately, what you really want, even if it's less information than you might like in a perfect world, you just want information that's going to let you make the best decision possible given your resources. So I want to talk about 3 different kinds of evaluations: goals, process, and outcome. And so goals-based evaluations really look at what is the status of your progress toward achieving your goals, right? So you set up a program, and I hope, again, of course, as you set up your logic model, you have a set of goals, accomplishments, right? And you probably have some kind of idea of a timeline. And so goals-based evaluations sort of look at your metrics, like how are you sort of measuring up, right? Are you on track? Have you kept your timeline? Do your personnel have adequate resources to meet those goals? And sometimes your goals change. You set up your clinic, you're working in the community, and you recognize, maybe you missed something in your needs assessment, and so your goals might shift. And an evaluation, and a goals-based evaluation can kind of let you do some course correction around that. And then also really thinking about moving forward, how should goals be established? I mean, in some ways, goals are dynamic things, and they change as your program evolves and grows or changes. A process-based evaluation really looks, again, right? Process is about the things you're doing. So have your activities been implemented as intended? And maybe what do your providers, the people who are giving the services, or your clients, the people who are getting them, right? So it could be patients, perceive to be the strengths and challenges of the program? And what recommendations for improvement do these folks have, right? So sort of really looking at what you're doing every day, and how effective it is. And then outcomes-based evaluations really look at the particular kinds of outcomes and whether or not you've really started to see these changes in mental health or well-being. And I want to note here that sometimes, we have many desired goals potentially, but we're going to have to prioritize our outcomes for the evaluation. And so particularly if you have time, limited time or resources, you want to pick the top 2 to 4, right? You can always hopefully come back, or you can create a plan for your organization to come back and look at other things. So now we're going to move to what are some of the methods, and this is not an in-depth tutorial or coverage of methods. I will create a couple of other presentations for you on like how to run a focus group and how to design survey questions, because I think those are 2 particularly important skills. But for the moment, we're going to give you like a quick kind of broad overview. So we tend to think about methods in 2 particular ways. They're actually not always necessarily distinct, but we'll talk about them in that way here. We have quantitative, right? So we think of these as numbers-based, and then qualitative, more narrative-based, more elaborated, kind of in-depth. Often that's how we think of qualitative methods. You can also do documentation review. We'll talk about that. And observational studies, which actually can be qualitative or quantitative, depending on how you decide to use your information. So we'll talk about that. So probably the most common evaluation method, and in some ways this is because people believe that this is a really easy method, and I think that's a little bit misleading. I think it is actually, it's an art and a science to design effective surveys. And I will, as I said, create a presentation for you on asking questions in surveys. But surveys have some distinct advantages. And of course, the first is that you can, again, depending on how responsive your respondents are, but you can quickly gather information from lots of people, right? Surveys can also be very advantageous because they can be, depending, of course, on what you need them for, but they can be designed to be completely anonymous. And this can make them quite non-threatening, particularly if you're dealing with sensitive issues. They're easy to analyze and make comparisons. Of course, this is assuming you know how to analyze them correctly and how you have, and that you have enough people to make comparisons that are really, statistically meaningful. And oftentimes, the really nice thing about surveys, and I would definitely recommend if you decide to create a survey, is that you do some due diligence and see if the kinds of questions that you want to ask already exist and have been what we call standardized, right? So have been used in other published evaluations. Most people are familiar with surveys. They kind of know what to do, right? So in some ways, they're easy in that sense. But surveys also, of course, have some disadvantages. The first is that you might not get careful feedback from people. So, depending on how you do your survey, you send out an online survey and people are completing it while they're watching TV, right? So they're not necessarily always focused on your survey necessarily. This will go back. I really recommend if you are going to create a survey that you look at the presentation on questions and designing good questions, because the wording of your questions can really affect your results, it can bias your responses, and it doesn't give you an in-depth understanding of a program or process, right? So it's in some ways, you create the questions you want to ask, and it's challenging to get additional information or to get really an in-depth understanding of people's experience of something from a survey alone. I just want to note here that when we go through each of these methods, we'll talk about advantages and disadvantages, and that there are always disadvantages, right? You're always sort of doing this cost-benefit analysis when you pick an evaluation method. Counts are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They are you sort of look at counts, how much of something, right? So the advantage to them is that they are kind of what we might call objective data, but this actually is really contingent on whether or not you have a reliable source, right? So in theory, they cannot be biased by people's own views, but if you're looking at attendance records for your drop-in clinic and you have somebody who's been fudging the numbers, then of course they lose that objectivity. So you do really want to make sure you trust the source of your counts. They're pretty easy to collect, and they can show really powerful change, right, if it's there. And there again, they have the advantage of being really easy to understand, right? Like people understand that 100 is more than 80, right? That if you're sort of serving more people each month, people can kind of see that increase. Whether or not it's statistically significant is a different question, but I think they're very kind of we grasp counts easily, and that actually really is important. It goes back to that question of who's your audience, right? Who are you trying to help make a decision or convince that your program is effective? Disadvantages are similar to surveys. They just really don't give you an in-depth understanding of a program. They're not really good, I think, for the kinds of process questions that we might care about. So that whole like middle part of your logic model. They can be limited in what they tell you about process or outcomes. I just said that. And I just cannot emphasize this enough. You really have to trust the source of your counts. So if there's some doubt there, then I think, you really need to consider if that's the best method. Interviews. I think there's something so intuitively appealing to us about qualitative methods because we love stories, and I think stories can be very, very powerful in conducting evaluations. So we'll talk about a few different ways of kind of getting these more narrative kinds of data or information. So the advantage of in interviews, usually we talk about them one-on-one, right? So you sit down with somebody, you have some questions, and you ask them these questions, and you can really go deep, right? You can truly get a kind of in-depth understanding of a person's understanding of how a program works or their experience with it. In some cases, you can develop a relationship with the person being interviewed, and that actually might be kind of advantageous both for collecting the information itself and maybe even more long-term in terms of your own program and your community building. And this actually brings up a really interesting issue related to evaluations, which is as an evaluator, oftentimes you may also be involved in your program, right? So it's, I think, a really interesting kind of positionality that I don't have time to get into here, but that I think is really interesting to think about. It can be a flexible format. So, if something comes up in an interview, you're right there, right? You're talking to the person and you can ask them about it. That is not something you can do in a survey. Even if at the end of your survey, you have sort of an open-ended, is there anything we didn't ask you? Tell us about it. You're limited to what they write. And you can't say, "Ooh, tell me more," right? Tell me more about X, Y, or Z. And you can do that kind of in this on-the-fly way in an interview. Disadvantages are that they can be super resource intensive. They take time. They take money, potentially, right? If your time is money. And you need to have properly trained interviewers. And you most particularly do not want, you really have to think carefully about this, especially if you're it goes back to that question about relationships, right? So if you have an interviewee or an interviewer who is not properly trained or is not good at doing interviews, especially if you're dealing with sensitive topics, these kinds of interactions can really, in some ways, then damage, right? Not just your ability to get effective information for your evaluation, but potentially even your program. Interviewers can bias responses, right? Every, of course, method has ways in which bias can creep in, but the interviewer itself can bias your responses. And I really cannot stress enough when you're using these kinds of person interaction-based research methods, you have to think about questions of power and positionality and who really is going to be the most effective at getting the kind of information you want. And there's no one right answer. You have to sort of understand what you want to know. But, if you have your clinicians doing these interviews to do program evaluation with your clients, well, people might not feel comfortable telling their therapist or their health worker what they don't like about the service they're providing, right? So you probably want to think, okay, I want somebody a little bit removed, right? So that we can really get the real scoop, if you will, for people. Interviews can be difficult and time-consuming to analyze, and comparing responses across interviews can be challenging if that's the end goal. So you really have to think about what decisions you want to make and what kind of information do you need in order to make it. Focus groups are as the name would sort of sound, group-based discussions around a particular topical focus, right? So it might be, of course, around your program. Again, this really allows you to go deep dive, quickly get a lot of information from multiple people, assuming, of course, you can schedule them. And it really can allow you to identify common or uncommon issues, because what you have is something might come up in a focus group, and then the degree to which other people sort of agree that this is a problem or a challenge, or that this is an advantage of your program, or the level of disagreement is information for you. Disadvantages is you really, similar to interviews, you want a well-trained group facilitator. And you need to develop effective questions and really consider group dynamics. And this, I'll have a presentation on focus groups and I'll talk about this, right? You really want to think about who's in the room. For example, I worked with a student who's doing focus groups in communities in India, and she had to really think about within the communities. She actually ended up doing age-based groups, because what she found, and she actually thought about gender and other status identities, because within the community she was working, people wouldn't disclose as much, right? If there was a high status person and a bunch of, let's say, lower status people. So you really need to sort of think about this, right? And status, of course, is really contingent on the context. So you really want to think about who's in the room. And it can work to have what I might call mixed status or mixed power groups. There's, again, no right or wrong answer, but you really need to understand your community in order to design effective focus groups. It can be logistically tricky to schedule multiple people. So, yes, you can get lots of data from lots of people, but only if you can get them into the room at the same time. And similarly, we can create these biased responses. You might, again, going back to this issue, you just might have somebody who's super outspoken, right? Or confrontational in your group. And this changes the dynamic and can bias the kinds of responses people might be scared to speak up. And this, of course, is why you need a really effective facilitator. It can be difficult, again, and time consuming to sort of analyze and figure out, again, how to compare responses. Finally, case studies are true deep dives. You don't necessarily have to do an interview, by the way, to do a case study. But the idea here is that you really understand one or more person and their experiences. It can be a really effective means of showing outsiders your program or creating a kind of story. But again, it's really time consuming. And it can show depth of experience, because you have this one person, you dive really, really deep, but it might not highlight the breadth of experiences, right? Particularly if you're just kind of selecting one or two people's experiences to study. Okay, so document review is basically you have some documentation associated with your program and you use that as your data. You use that as your information. Again, it has the advantage of potentially being objective, assuming you have a reliable source, and your method of interpreting the documents isn't biased in some way. You're not cherry picking, for example, the examples that show your program at its best. Data can be easy to come by, right? So you're probably creating some kind of documentation just in the day-to-day running of your program. And it's not disruptive to the program itself, right? Like this is sort of happening. You can collect the documentation, look at it behind the scenes. It can be multifunctional. So depending on the documents, you can actually look at different pieces of your logic model, different parts of your program. Disadvantages are, again, you might not get the same in-depth understanding of a program as you get from other methods. It can actually be quite labor and time intensive depending on the kinds of documents you have. And you're actually really limited in some ways to what you're documenting. So, if you created your documents for one purpose, but you need a different kind of information, they might not be really effective or useful to you. And you only have the data that's collected there on the forums, right? Sort of like surveys. You design your survey, you have that information, but you can't always go back and get more or ask people to elaborate on things. Observational study is, again, kind of what it sounds like. You go and you watch, right? You watch some aspect of your program, you observe it. Again, we can think of this as kind of, you can collect some objective data, but assuming you have a reliable observer, right, and your method of interpreting isn't biased, you're watching the program or the process as it's occurring, and that can be really interesting and rich. And again, and this actually speaks to, who you are as the observer, but you can respond to these on-the-ground issues as they happen, right, if you decide to. Again, this can be actually quite resource intensive, right? It takes time to do good observations, to write detailed notes, to interpret them. It can be actually difficult to categorize or interpret or analyze data in a meaningful way when you do observational studies. And sometimes it can be complicated to translate that for outsiders. And then, of course, the observer themselves can bias the program or process just by being there, right? So, if you send in a supervisor as your observer, she might make her supervisees uncomfortable, and it might actually change the program, right? So there's sort of this way in which you're introducing bias in that sense. All right, so I want to turn to ethics. I think, we're potentially, if you've ever done a research study, you're familiar, most institutions have this institutional review board. It kind of reviews your study and makes sure that it's ethical, right? That you're not going to harm the people that you are interacting with, that you're not going to hurt anybody. You're going to keep people's information private. And in theory, because evaluations are not research, they're not subject to IRB, for example, review. But I really want to stress that it's so important for you as an evaluator to think about ethics, right? And in some ways, it's important because you care about the well-being of your program. And so you want to be ethical. So if your evaluation in any way includes collecting information from clients, even if it's using their medical records and they've sort of, you want to get consent from them. And that might mean at the time that they are, doing an intake into your program, you just let them know, hey, we're going to be collecting documentation and that may be used to help us improve our programs. Do you consent to have your documentation used? And then, of course, you have to make a decision. Can people opt out of that? Can they say, you know what, I'm not comfortable being evaluated in that particular way? And you really want them to sort of understand, especially, of course, if you're interviewing people or doing a survey, what you're going to be doing. But even if you are looking at their medical records, just explain to them, what the purpose is, and how that information might be used. You don't always know up front, and so you might want to sort of consider the ways in which you might want to use the information and just give people some idea. I feel strongly that people should have the choice not to be included. There might be cases where for some reason that's not pragmatic, it's not practical. So you want to, but just really think about that, right? What does it mean to think about consent really deeply? People's information should always be kept confidential. And this is just non-negotiable, right? You lose trust, you violate trust when you are not keeping people's information confidential. And so that's actually something to think about, particularly as you do interviews, focus groups, or case studies, right? That you really let people know how their data will be used. Are they going to be identifiable, right? And are you comfortable with that? Some people are, and some people are not. And you have to really think about that. You might want to have a consent form depending on the context. I think it's, there are some cultural contexts or particular contexts where having a consent form actually it doesn't build trust. And you might decide that it's not within the context you're working and you are the expert, that doesn't necessarily make sense. So ethics. So let's talk about how do we select a method to use? And I just cannot stress this enough, that ultimately you have to always go back, right, to this question of what do you want to know for who, right? And then really thinking about cost effectiveness and really being realistic based on who your clients are, what your program is. That's always going to guide, right? That's always going to guide your decision making. You ideally might want to use a combination of methods. We call this kind of triangulation. Doesn't mean you always have to have 3 different methods, but it's the idea that you get information from multiple sources to kind of confirm, again, as resources allow, to kind of confirm that your program's working in the way you think it's working, or just to corroborate different stories, if you will. So you might, get your questionnaire out there. You got a lot of information from a lot of people, and then you decide to interview a subset of them to sort of really get that in-depth picture of things. Or a case study that might highlight, let's say, if you've particularly unique or notable things happening in your program. So they're not typical, but they're really worth highlighting for whatever reason, let's say to a donor. So again, you just want to look at these questions to ask yourself, right? What information do you need to make decisions about a project or project really, this should say, sorry, or program? And how much of it can be analyzed in a kind of non-resource intensive way? I think that tends to be very, very important for most program evaluators, right? You're generally speaking not evaluating rich programs, so to speak. How accurate will your information be? And can you just live with the disadvantages of your method? And there always are going to be disadvantages. So you just have to be able to really believe that the information you're getting is the best, right? To make the decision you want to make. And is it going to be as comprehensive? Look, nothing is going to be perfect, but is it going to be as comprehensive, again, as you can live with? Here are some additional questions. I think it is really important to think about, again, what is the purpose of your evaluation? Who do you need to be credible to? Because in some ways, being credible to your patients or your clients might be different than to funders, right? They might have different interests. And so you really want to think about who you're doing the evaluation for. And again, sometimes you have multiple people, and so that question becomes complicated. You really want to think about who are your participants, right? So if you are running a drop-in center for people who are homeless or marginally housed, you probably don't want to necessarily do an online questionnaire, right? An online survey, because when will they access it or how will they access it? So unless you know, for example, you have at your center computers for people to use, or you know that they all have access to the library and you give them that information, a questionnaire, an online survey may not be the best method for that particular audience. So you really want to think carefully about, not only what you need to know, but how you're getting that information and from whom, and like what is going to sort of best work for those folks. And then you really want to think about what training is required for you or whomever it is that's going to be sort of collecting the information from you. And how can the data be analyzed? If you collect a bunch of interview data and then have no time or means of or capability of looking at that information, then it's useless to you, right? You're better off collecting some survey data. So you really want to be realistic about what you can do and how you can do it in terms of analyzing the data in addition to collecting it. Okay, so we cannot do a sort of comprehensive here discussion of how to analyze and interpret your data or information, but I just want to remind you of these things. And the first, of course, is that you always, always, always start from a review of the goal of the evaluation, right? Why did you do this? This is really going to help you focus on what's important in your data and really help sort of streamline and focus your analysis. I also want to think about, once you have some data, right? Once you've sort of done some interpretation and some understanding, you need to put that in perspective for people, right? So that might be in relation to what you or the program staff expected. It might be that there are common standards in your program area, right? That there are sort of things should be happening, and you want to see that your program is how it compares to that. You want to look back at your original program goals, right? You want to look at your outcomes, and you also might want to just describe, right? What's your program been through? What are some of the experiences here? What are some, I say weaknesses here, you can call them challenges, opportunities for growth. And so you want to have some recommendations, right? I think, your job here is not just to collect the information, but it's really to make it understandable to people, to help invite in your stakeholders to really understand why this information is going to be useful to them, right? So you want to have some recommendations. Now, you don't have to, do it alone. You can sort of be collaborative, but every evaluation should have some recommendations that emerge from it. And then those recommendations need to be recorded somewhere, and you need to be accountable to them, right? So you do not want to make recommendations that you just know the program can never do. I mean, they're useless, right? And the whole point of an evaluation is to be useful, right? Is to really, on the ground, be useful to improving your program. So I'm going to just talk about evaluation reports. And, I'm always happy to answer questions as you're working on your report, or if you work on a report, but you just want to think again, who are you writing the report to? How are you going to translate your recommendations to concrete action plans? Who's going to do those, right? Who's going to be responsible for each of those recommendations? And so what I've done here on the next page is I've given you some suggested sections of a report. So oftentimes it's helpful to start with an executive summary. This is your summary of basically what are the big take-home points from your evaluation? What are the big things? If people only read the executive summary, they should come home, kind of come away with understanding what your conclusions and recommendations were. But in terms of sections, you want to describe the organization and the program, right? Under evaluation, sort of giving context, right? You sort of start with giving context. You want to be very specific about what your evaluation goals were, how you did your evaluation, and then how you analyzed the information that was collected by the evaluation itself. You want to list your conclusions and recommendations resulting from those conclusions. Some reports, especially if it's an internal document, let's say, will also then have an action plan section, and any relevant attachments. So show people the survey, show them the interview questions, anything that's sort of relevant to the evaluation itself. Okay, so that's the end of this this lecture. Good luck. I hope to see you all in a few weeks. And as you're working on your projects, do feel free to contact me. I'm happy to answer any questions to help you with survey development. You have your information and you're just overwhelmed by writing a report. Please consider me a resource for you. Okay, thank you.